Okay, so I'm going to be talking about a book I published last year that, as Dr. Latif says, is really my attempt to understand the system that you guys have just spent this semester trying to figure out. And I can remember my first introduction to international tax was sort of after college, before law school, when I was working for economists that were working at KPMG doing transfer pricing. And I was startled to find that economists were basically just doing the math for lawyers, for tax lawyers. And I said, what is this tax law thing? It sounds fascinating. And I immediately went to law school and have been, for the next couple of decades trying to figure out, basically why somebody would come up with the system as wacky, frankly, as transfer pricing. Well, who thinks that's a good idea? You guys have studied it for a while now. Really, if you were setting up a system that actually wanted to work, I don't think transfer pricing is really where you would start. Okay, so how did I get to the answer that I'm going to share with you today? I'm going to give you a little bit of quiz to start. Can anybody tell me who this is? You can throw it in the chat. Let's see. Can I open the chat? Am I adept enough to do that? Oh, back to our guy here. All right, so who's in the chat? Yes. All right, that was okay. That was too easy. I'll make the next one harder. So that, in fact, is King Charles. Used to be Prince Charles, of course. This is at the independence celebration in the Bahamas, where I grew up. So I grew up in the Bahamas. My dad is from there. My mom is American, and spent my childhood down in the islands and came here for school and have stuck around. But I was about not quite one when this would have happened. And mom likes this photo because she and dad were dancing just a little bit behind where this photo is. So she was there, and she remembers those balloons as well. So she had at some point collected four of those balloons. I have three older sisters, and so she had collected one for each of us. And at some point, Prince Charles wanders up to her and says, I'm paraphrasing, says like, "Lady, what's with the balloons? What are you doing?" And I like to think that Prince Charles was thinking to himself, first, I lose this colony that has helped make me rich, right? These colonies were a big part of what helped make my family so vastly wealthy. And part of that was all of the schools and hospitals they never built because they didn't have to, because they weren't answerable to the people there. And now independence was going to cost him that source of wealth. And to make matters worse, this lady's stealing his balloons, and she's just, he just couldn't handle it. So that's sort of where things begin for me at this party with Prince Charles. Okay, so but we're really here to talk about today is this. So I assume now that after a semester with Dr. Latif, you're one of the few groups of people in the world who can look at this chart and have some idea of what it means. Is that fair, Dr. Latif? That your students can read this and make sense of it. And again, most of the world looks at this and says, I have no idea what this is. I see an American flag, I see an Irish flag and a Dutch flag. I don't really get it. Something bad is happening here, but I don't really understand it. You guys do. And the question for me is how, and this is, I think, what Dr. Latif was getting at, how did we end up in this system, right? How did we end up in a system where this is a reality, where Google and Apple can, in a conference room, in some law firm, over the course of a week, set up a structure that is going to make sure that they don't pay any tax? How could we set up a system like that? And of course, I think what I don't think Dr. Latif would tell you this, but generally what you will be told is that the reason is that we have an international tax system that is a century old. It was set up in the 1920s. And back then we couldn't know how rough and tumble global capitalism would be. And so we just couldn't possibly have known how rapacious multinationals would be. So we couldn't, the wonderful old men who set up that system 100 years ago just were naive. Right? They were naive. They hoped everybody would be better behaved than they are. They're not, so we're stuck with transactions like this that make sure that we can't have nice things. Right? We can't have schools, we can't have hospitals because it's so hard to tax these multinationals. And my book really challenges that idea that the problem was naivete 100 years ago. And what's the evidence I have for that? One of the things that I found, so when I first started at Boston University a couple of years ago, one of the first things I did was wander over to the Harvard Rare Book Library. They have the papers of a Harvard professor who was also President John F. Kennedy's chief tax advisor. So I was very excited to go and look in his papers. And one of the reasons is I knew about this. So in 1961, President Kennedy sends a message to Congress, and he says that we have a problem, and the problem is that multinationals are forming foreign subsidiaries, and they're using it to exploit the multiplicity of foreign tax systems. And I thought it's really amazing. And international agreements. This is double tax treaties in order to reduce or sharply eliminate their tax liabilities both at home and abroad. So again, right? So he could be describing this. Right? This is what he's talking about essentially. They didn't call it a double Irish sandwich, but when you hear the kinds of transactions he's talking about intangibles being moved around into other jurisdictions, and of course he's specifically talking about Switzerland. But they at this point understood what the problem was. They understood what our problem was, and as you'll see in a minute, the timing is very significant, right? So why is the timing significant? This chart, which I stole from the U.S. Treasury Department, shows corporate U.S. This is just in the U.S. corporate income tax receipts as a share of total federal tax revenues from 1950 to 2003, and this could be. If you are creating a montage for a movie of terrible things happening to business, you might stick in this chart, right? This is bad. So if this is a chart of something you're doing, you are doing it wrong. So of course, this is around, you can see where revenues first start to drop off. That's around when Kennedy was talking about international agreements and complaining that they were preventing the United States. They weren't so worried about other countries. They were preventing the United States from taxing these multinationals. They're forming foreign subsidiaries, Swiss subsidiaries, in order to accomplish this. And what's so remarkable is, even though President Kennedy knew this was a problem, nothing happened, or something happened, but it was more of the same, right? So he complained about this, and nothing happened. And part of the mystery is why. So why, if they knew what the problem was something not done? And I'll show soon that, in fact, the problem wasn't just that they didn't fix the problem, they doubled down on it. And I'll explain why that was. So one reason, you won't be surprised to learn that corporations were really unhappy about this, right? They didn't like the idea of the US getting better at taxing them. They were really enjoying those foreign subsidiaries and the ability to engage in whatever they called the double Irish Dutch sandwiches of the day. So in Surrey's papers, I found this whole series of letters that Surrey was personally writing. Again, this is Kennedy's chief tax policy advisor, saying that what they were going to do to attack the problem was going to be a lot less harsh than what they had originally talked about. And what they ultimately did is they created Subpart F, which is the first controlled foreign corporation legislation. So this was their effort to fix the problem created by tax treaties and by the planning that multinationals were engaged in, was essentially to create controlled foreign corporation regimes, which is both an aggressive move, but far less aggressive than something else they might have done and that they were originally considering. So a more limited purpose than the original recommendations on deferral of income.
Yes.
They were generally going to get rid of all deferral. Basically, what GILTI and global minimum tax did. They didn't do it at the time, in part because multinationals were really unhappy about it. But there's another story as well. So another story is that the place where multinationals were forming their subsidiaries in Kennedy's time were in Switzerland. This was completely obvious in that letter to Congress. Kennedy specifically calls out Switzerland. That was sort of the tax haven of the day, and Switzerland was so mad about their investigation that they threatened to prosecute Kennedy's team. So they were really unhappy about it, and that's one reason why they would pull back. Another reason was this was at the height of the Cold War. So in the early 1960s, the U.S. broke off diplomatic relations with Cuba. So there were no diplomatic relations with Cuba, no U.S. embassy there. And the only way that the U.S. was maintaining a presence and any sort of dialogue with Cuba was through the Swiss embassy. So Switzerland was literally help preventing World War III. So the last thing that the U.S. could do was, get so mad about its multinationals avoiding taxation that they would say terminate the Swiss treaty. So part of what was happening at the time, and the reason we had this message by Kennedy to Congress, there weren't many treaties at this point. And this is before the OECD existed, so there weren't very many treaties. But there was a treaty that had been signed in the early 50s with Switzerland, which then allowed these multinationals to form Swiss subsidiaries. They quickly figured out how to take advantage of that and were abusing it. So this was a Swiss problem, but there was no way that the U.S. felt they could fix the problem specific to Switzerland. So this was the problem. So again, so we didn't fix the problem. We ended up making it worse. Two things happened on the very same day, and I don't know how you guys feel about coincidences. I'm not really a conspiracy theorist, but this seems like an awfully big coincidence to me. So on December 14th, 1960, the OECD Charter was signed. This was transforming the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, so the OEEC, was transformed into the OECD by adding Canada and the United States. So you add Europe to Canada and the United States, and you get a nice global organization. Of course, that is not true, but that is how they presented it. And this happened on the very same day that this lovely sentiment was expressed at the General Assembly of the United Nations, talking about the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples. Right. So the the concern really is about who is going to be in charge and who's going to make decisions on global tax policy. And at this moment, the global North was really quite concerned that the global South was going to take over. You guys have probably the reality we know today is one where the OECD is just the overwhelmingly dominant force in global tax policy. And part of that is about their expertise, right? These are the folks who know everything about global tax, and we just assume that that's why they're in charge, because they are the ones who have the knowledge. And what's so entertaining to me is that if you look at, and this is from another book that you guys should check out, Nikki Tio's book, The United Nations Global Tax Coordination. What she talks about is what was happening at the United Nations in the lead up to the formation of the OECD. What the United Nations was doing was their very best to entrench pro global South tax policies that had been in place since the 1920s. So when Europe was devastated by World War I, what the United States did was essentially create the foreign tax credit, which was this very generous approach that said, Europe, why don't you just keep all the money, all the tax revenues from all our cross-border activity? If you pay tax to a European country, Germany, France, anything, we're going to let that country keep all the money, and we're not going to impose any tax to the U.S. So that was what had been happening. But now, after World War II, in the 1950s, the possibility of this whole new wave of newly independent countries taking advantage of that generosity really was a problem. That was really a problem, both because the global South, as more countries became independent, were going to control the UN, right? In the 1950s, they were sort of at the tipping point where the numbers were getting closer to numbers that would favor the global South, but they weren't quite there yet. And then there's the reality that these newly independent states, one of the things they wanted to do was build schools and hospitals. And one of the ways they were going to pay for that was by taxing the global North's multinationals. This was really a problem for the global North. They had the OEEC become the place where they got involved in international tax. And it wasn't because they were experts. As you can see at this first meeting, the UN was so they felt so bad for the OECD or the OEC that they really didn't know what they were doing. So they offered to send them technical help. And it's just so amazing for me to imagine a world where the UN feels so bad for the OECD that they offer to send them technical help. It's really pretty incredible. But that was the reality at the time. Why the switch then, right? So why did the OECD take over? It wasn't because they had the technical expertise. It was all of the UN. The OECD didn't have it. So these two maps are from the CIA map library, and the colors don't quite match up, but the dark gray on the left and the light gray on the right show independent states. And the point of these two maps is that 1960 is when so much changed. More than a dozen countries gained independence in 1960. And again, that's the year, they called it the Year of Africa. That was the same year that the OECD was formed, in part over these fears about what these countries would do now they were independent. So this great book, Lee Gardner, about colonial taxation in Africa, she observes that upon independence, exactly what these countries feared would happen happened. They dramatically increased their spending on schools and hospitals, and were unable to sustain them. And Lee Gardner really makes the case that this was not just bad for spending, it was bad for these fledgling democracies. They were unable, because of tax constraints, to make good on the promises that they had made to their people, and that really had long-standing effects far beyond just education and healthcare. And understanding what was really happening at this time, it's important to put in context what the world was like then, right? So not only was the world different in that the OECD were not the ones with all the expertise, but it was also a place where racism and distrust of these new countries had a real visceral element to it. So this is Vanessa Ogle, an historian at Yale, who talks about the way the global North reacted to independence. And they were really fearful of what these newly independent African countries would do. She specifically cites the fear of increased taxation. And again, that's how you pay for schools and hospitals. You increase taxation or nationalization. And Europe and North America did not like it at all. They were not pleased the prospect of increased taxation. They just did not think that these majority black countries were competent. And again, so I grew up in the Bahamas. So I grew up studying pirates. I didn't do a lot of studying of US history. So I had to do some catching up when I read the book. And one of the stories that I learned about the US that I think is really relevant for the story we're telling here is what happened after the US Civil War. So again, you guys are probably like me and didn't know a lot about this, but I looked into it. And what happened, oh, so I lost my camera. I guess that's okay, but I will turn it back on if I can. There we go. So after the Civil War, there was a decade or two where newly freed blacks were able to vote. They were able to serve in Congress. They were judges, they were governors. And part of what made this possible was a real strong presence by the North, not the global North, the US North in the South. Military deployed in the South to ensure that voting happened properly, to ensure that people were safe. But after a decade or two, everybody's attention faded. the federal military withdrew, and there was, an incredible wave of violence and voting fraud. You've all heard of the Ku Klux Klan. This was not sort of a fringe group. This was a mainstream part of the country that really engaged in a campaign of terror that was seen nowhere else. That slavery was ended in the Western Hemisphere. It was really an extraordinary time, and all of that is bad, right? All of that is bad. But one of the real frightening lessons was the story of that period became sort of twisted, and what uh, the there was a group. Have you guys heard of Edwin Seligman? Have you talked about Edwin Seligman, Dr. Latif?
No, we haven't, unfortunately, no.
Oh no, that's great. I'm really glad. So often, no, that's definitely a win. So in the story of global tax, there is often this very sort of white savior approach that's told that these four economists, they're called, created the global taxes in the 1920s, and weren't they wonderful? They're all sort of like Gandalf, just lovely and perfect and smart, and they created the system. And so that is true that these four economists were really important, especially one by the name of Edmund Seligman. And what's so incredible is that Edmund Seligman was at Columbia University at the time here in New York. And this group of that he was part of, his cohort, his mentor, his friends, they were part of a team of historians who persuaded the country that the reason that Reconstruction, which is this process of blacks being involved in the nation's civic life, the reason it failed was not because of voting fraud and violence, but because blacks were really bad at it. They were really not very smart. They were really just not very competent. Um, and this story, thanks to these really talented but twisted historians, was so successful that there was a history book around the time when my mother was still in school in the States that told a story that after the Civil War, that dozens of formerly enslaved people, when they were freed, were so unprepared to live their own lives that they just lay down and died. This was in a history book taught to high school students in the 1950s in the United States. So the story was that the reason that there was not a black member of Congress from Virginia after 1880 until maybe 1970 was because blacks were just really bad at governing. And everybody had seen that in that period, and they didn't want it to happen again. And part of what was happening in this period was not only this sort of rational fear that the global north rationally feared that African countries would take their stuff to build schools and hospitals. That's, I think, a rational fear. But there was also this deeply irrational fear that allowing them to do that was going to be a problem, not just because it would be, why would they do that? Why would they allow Europe to rebuild after World War I or World War II with a foreign tax credit, but then change things in the 1950s and 60s? It's not just because they were selfish. If they were just selfish, they wouldn't have allowed Europe to rebuild in the way they did. But there was this racist fear that allowing majority black states this power would be dangerous even for the majority black states. And what they should do is not allow them to tax and spend as they wish, but control it through foreign aid, right? So we'll keep all the money. We'll give it back to them in ways that'll be better for them than if we allowed them to collect it on their own. So it seems incredible this would be the way that these highly intelligent folks would think. So I'm going to offer you something that is really blew my mind when I saw it. So this is the famous economist John Maynard Keynes. So he's talking about a conference that was leading up to the United Nations, and he sees this conference that included countries like Liberia, which of course was independent in the 40s. And he says, he calls it the most monstrous monkey house assembled for years, right? So this is the reality of what what drove these states to change course. So there was a very generous pro capital importing country system in place. There was a move towards treaties in the 50s that really created an obvious problem for the global north, and Kennedy saw that. And what's so remarkable is that despite all that, that you had this happen, right? So this is a chart I found in another colleague's article. He was just writing about the dissemination of tax treaty provisions, trying to figure out which models were most dominant. And it's really striking when I saw this. This is just the source of, this is just the number of treaties in operation. And so, of course, he was told the same story I was, that the treaty-based system was set up in the 20s. We've been stuck with it ever since. And so he has the chart started in the 1920s. But it turns out that's not really true. We essentially had no treaties until the 1950s, when Kennedy starts complaining about these international agreements. And he points out that they're a terrible idea when we just have, maybe a few hundred. And what's the response? Well, we create the OECD. It creates its first model treaty in 1963. And all of a sudden, we're awash with them. So the question for me is why the global north would sabotage itself in this way. And again, I know the world is not cannot entirely be understood through the US perspective, but I think understanding how important the United States was at the time and how both its good parts and its bad parts had an impact on the world is you can't ignore it. There's a story that's told about what happened when cities and towns in the United States were forced to integrate. So one of the things they were forced to do was to integrate their swimming pools. So there used to be public swimming pools all over the country, and blacks couldn't swim there. And in the middle of the century, they were forced by the Supreme Court to integrate their pools so that everybody could swim there. And a lot of cities and towns, and this is absolutely true, shut down their pools rather than integrating them. They'd rather nobody have access to pools than everybody. It's irrational, right? Would you really rather have nobody have a pool than to share it with somebody that looks different than you? But that's what was happening in the United States. And that's really what was happening globally here. So you can see the chart I showed you earlier was US corporate tax revenues as a share of total federal revenues. Now, this is breaking it down as a share of GDP. So you might think that part of what was happening is that the individual income tax was taking off, and that was depressing the share of corporate tax revenues as a share of federal tax revenues. But this is showing it as GDP, so this should correct for that. And you can see that the light blue line is the individual income tax becoming more important as a percentage of GDP, but you still see the dark blue line is showing the same pattern as in the earlier chart, where it's declining as a percent of GDP. And again, why would this be happening? Well, it's happening for the reasons that Kennedy identified, but that were not solved, but were made worse as treaties proliferated, as the OECD took over for the UN, as revenues were shifted from the global north, from the global south to the global north. All of these things happened as a result of these dramatic changes that happened in the 1960s that have been largely ignored until now. All right. I know you guys know that this is not what a coconut tree actually looks like, right? You guys probably are aware of that when coconuts grow on trees, they don't look like this. So I grew up in the islands. I know this very well. One of the reasons that coconuts are all over the Bahamas, they're just an image of my childhood, is because coconuts float, right? They have the outer husk that's thick and buoyant. When you buy them at a grocery store, they look like this. They're the little round brown things. But on a tree, they don't look like that because they have the big husk on them. And if they look like this, they would not float. So that doesn't make any sense. But this ridiculous image of a coconut tree is sort of the OECD's answer to why we have the double Irish Dutch sandwich. And of course, I don't think they have coconut trees like this in Ireland or the Netherlands, but nevertheless, this is their answer for why we have those problems. This is from the OECD's 2021 brochure explaining its two-pillar proposal, right? So this is its effort to show why we need a global minimum tax at 15%, not the right rate. I'm sure Dr. Leaf will tell you that. Why we need this. They say essentially we need this not because we have treaties, not because the OECD has been bad at governing global tax policy for decades, but because these small island states have been so successful at undermining the global tax system that these four economists set up 100 years ago, none of which is true. And we need a global minimum tax to protect ourselves against these small island developing states, which is a ridiculous story. So I wrote about this and I was really mad about it, wrote about it once, and was going to write about it again, and went back to the website to make sure that I had the right link for this incredibly offensive chart. And it turns out that I had the right link, but they had modified this image. They took out the island and they put in a third sort of glass office tower, sort of pretending it never happened. They kept the copyright date at 2021 while changing the image, which I thought was really funny. And I, of course, wrote about that because I thought it was, I was both happy that he changed it, but wasn't going to give them credit for just doing it quietly without admitting the mistake. And then they just pretended like they never published the brochure. But of course, nothing disappears on the internet, so you can still find it out there. Not on the, you won't find it on the OECD site, but you can find it out there on the internet. Um, so how do we get there? Of course, this is the this is the OECD, right? This is the group of countries that formed the OECD in 1960. They claim they're a global operation, but that is definitely not global. You may notice some pretty important continents missing from that entirely. Right, these are the countries that are not in the OECD. That is a lot of countries, including some you may have strong feelings about, maybe being in one right now. So that is how we get this kind of system, right? How do we get a system that is so broken and so different from the system we had for the first few decades? You put it in the hands of just a small group of countries that are not only selfish, and that's fine. Selfish is okay. I'm not opposed to selfishness. The bigger problem is the irrational element that they eventually, you know, uh, created a system that was so damaging to their own interests that they ended up with those cratering corporate tax revenues. And for reasons they had clearly understood and articulated, as Kennedy had, yet, and despite knowing how dangerous it was, just sort of drove themselves off that cliff and ended up with a system that you guys have spent the semester learning about, which I love. It's super. It's a in a way, it's a very elegant system. But if what you're trying to do is prevent double Irish Dutch sandwiches, you would not have tax treaties, right? Why would you have tax treaties? You would not do it if that was your goal. And controlled form corporate regimes are one answer. Guilty is another answer. But an even better answer, I would say, is not creating a system that is so vulnerable. So thanks so much for listening. I look forward to chatting with you guys about this. I again appreciate you sharing a little bit of your last class with me.
Thank you so much, Prof. That was really amazing. I mean, I had the opportunity to engage with you previously and also in Geneva to hear you provide some of these talks. And I think relating that to our class today has really been fantastic. And I think from your lecture, before we open up the floor, I can see so many of us are clapping for you. So they've really enjoyed your lecture. And before we ask them to start intervening and asking you questions, I think you have really shown us that international tax law is not, and it has never been a neutral set of technical rules that somehow produce these unfair outcomes by accident. You have shown us that the unfairness, was the intention itself, that it was designed in specific rooms by specific people, the four economists that you've mentioned, at a specific time and moment in history. And that moment was chosen precisely when Africa was rising. And I think that for me is the touch base, right? And also, when I think about your work and having listened to you, it also brings me back to Kwame Nkrumah, and I'm very happy to see Isaac Aguirre. Dr. Aguirre is here with us. He's from Ghana, the land of Nkrumah. So I'm hoping I'll be able to hear him also make an intervention because I try to resonate your thinking with our Pan-Africanist, the president of Ghana at independence. And Nkrumah, he saw the extraction continuing after the flags changed, and he called it neocolonialism. And people called him angry. People, they called him paranoid. And you have gone into the archives, and what you have basically shown us in your slides about what you got from the Treasury and how we think about the evidence that Nkrumah left us with, we simply get to see that he was also correct in making this connection between racial capitalism and international tax law. And I think your talk has now given at least me the evidence behind this intuition. And that is the extraordinary thing to do, in this conversation around international tax law. And then we also have another of our Pan-Africanists. I'm not sure if the class is aware of him, Amical Cabral. And Cabral also said something that I keep returning to always in my own research and understanding of international tax law is the context of everything, right? That you've actually presented, that there are certain norms that have been the force behind the design of this entire global tax architecture. And he also said, right, that we must always return to the source, not reform what colonialism built, but return to what colonialism buried. And I think as we go and read your book and we appreciate the content of your book, we're going to get to now return to what colonialism buried and then go back to the drawing board at the global tax discussions that are taking place in New York as part of the designing of the global tax treaty on how to correct this problem that we have been facing on the continent as, a system that continues to extract from us going forward. So that was just a quick insight I wanted to share with you. Really appreciate your time with us. But as I let the colleagues, post their questions on chat or even raise their hands, I'll probably start off with my first question to you, Professor. Um, so now that the UN has a proper intergovernmental tax body, and many of us, we fought very hard for that. But my worry is this, yeah, 60 years of OECD rule have shaped how every tax official, how every tax negotiator, how every finance ministry thinks about international taxation. So even if we have now a better institution or with a better institution to come, are we just going to end up reproducing the same framework with more diverse faces in the room? Has the OECD already won, even if we change the venue?
So, again, I think what you're saying is it's so true and so frightening because it's so true. Um, it- it's so difficult to, we don't have the vocabulary even to talk about this. So, for example, one of the things that I talk about, in the book, I quote a speech by Nkrumah where he says that the black man is ready to manage his own affairs, and he meant that in one way, but I highlight how that would have sounded in the U.S. And there's a great story I tell in the book. Um, so African diplomats would travel between New York and Washington D.C. So the UN is in New York, but Washington D.C. is the capital, so they're going back and forth. And this is still in the 1950s and early 1960s, and they don't have any idea that if they're driving through a state like Maryland, um, they can't stop at a roadside diner and get food because they're not integrated, right? They can't go to restaurants. Restaurants aren't serving them because they're black, and they just can't. They're diplomats. They can't imagine. They can understand that there's racism in the U.S., but they're not Americans. They're Africans, and they just can't believe it's happening. And so somebody brings this up to Kennedy, and Kennedy's response is, why are these guys driving? They should fly. Why, like his response to their being, turned away from these roadside restaurants is, what are they? That's a terrible road. He remembers driving that, and he says, why would they? So again, it's a world where Kruma says that we are ready to take charge. That sounds like terrifying if you are in the United States, and you are going to take dramatic steps to prevent that. So, the real genius and the real success of the OECD is that after decades in charge, when so the G7 in 1998 says, why are we so bad at taxing multinationals? The same question that so Kennedy knew why we were bad at it, but over the next 30 years we forgot, and we had no idea why we were so bad at taxing multinationals. The OECD gets asked, why are we so bad at taxing multinationals? And they essentially say, it's not double tax treaties or anything like that. It's tax havens, and this is where they make the credible move of threatening. And I'm not making this up. It's going to sound totally insane. That they threatened sanctions on Liberia because Liberia in 2000 was a tax haven that was preventing the United States and Europe from collecting taxes from their own multinationals. I mean, this is Liberia when it's in either the Second Civil War or just the first again. And they really proposed imposing sanctions on Liberia, which just shows how successful they had been in hiding the evidence of their own complicity. That they could point the finger at Liberia, which was not at all innocent, but it certainly wasn't a tax haven. So it's just hard to believe that would be that was something that people would accept. And I think that there was a process. So I do not think that I think there's a process of education, of opening the eyes of people around the world to what's happening here. And I think it's a slow process. I don't think there's any one thing that the global South or any African country can do right now to fix things. But being able to tell the story more effectively and to understand what's happening is a huge step forward. It's not a solution, but it is at least stopping the bleeding, I think. And so, for example, one of the things I talk about in the book is so when Kennedy created controlled form corporation rules, the progenitors of guilty, right? This was essentially a way of redistributing tax revenues from the global South to the global North, right? That's not a controversial statement now. That's essentially what it did. And one of the things that I think would be a place to start, and this is not even, you could take much more radical steps in this. You could figure out what revenues went from which global South countries into which global North coffers. Mm-hmm. You can do the math on that pretty easily, and you could pay reparations, right? So if we were to do something like that, or at least to articulate the amount of revenues that have been stolen in this neo-colonial process over the last 60 years, I think that would really change the conversation. So there are things you could do that are even still not going to fix the problem, but would articulate and sort of show the contours of how big a theft has taken place over the last 6 decades. And that's the real problem. I think the OECD is still quite successful in suggesting that what's happening is just a neutral process that's motivated by economic efficiency and all those other things, and they can no longer tell that story effectively when the global South refuses to accept it. But I agree that we still don't have all the evidence, all of the just the if you were able to put a price tag on what's been taken from Kenya by way of tax treaties and controlled foreign corporation regimes over the decades, that would really wake some people up, because you could build a lot of schools and hospitals with that money.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Prof. I see Judy, your hand is up. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, please confirm if you can hear me.
Yes.
I can, thanks.
All right, thank you so much. That was a brilliant presentation. I really enjoyed every bit of it. And I don't know where to start, because it has been terrible, in my opinion, especially for us in the global South. Because if you think about it, countries in the global South have weak infrastructure, I mean, we have high political risk premiums, and the only thing we can do to attract investors is by giving them tax incentives. But then the OECD comes with Pillar 2 on the minimum tax, 15%. I mean, and then that is the one thing that we have that could have helped us. And then now countries are forced, like right now, to have their own unilateral minimum tax rate, top-up tax at 15%. Then now it is so bad because as global South countries, we are forced to do this, not just by the circumstances, but also by the lenders like IMF, World Bank. And we know that the money they are lending to us, much of it is from our own resources that have been taken from past years. And then now we are left wondering what to do. I mean, what do you propose would be policy measures? Unfortunately, when countries in the global South try to come up with a solution, their leaders mysteriously die or the governments are overthrown. I mean, it's crazy. So what do you propose, Prof, as a potential solution for all this and for the situation that we are in?
So, first of all, thank you, Judy. And I think you were the one who identified King Charles, so thank you also for that. I appreciate that. I think that what's so exciting about what's happening, and Dr. Latif knows this, how fast things are changing. If you would have told international tax experts 15 years ago that what's happening in the UN would be happening, they would have thought you were insane. I mean, it was inconceivable that what is happening would actually happen. And that's really encouraging. It's really encouraging that we're seeing this. It's what's happening seems so inadequate, and I think that's what you're feeling. And I agree with that. It's not nearly enough. But the mere fact that it's not enough, if you were able to, and I'm old, so I've seen the world be very different than it is now. 10 years ago, the idea that the UN would really assert itself in this way would have seemed just ridiculous, just absolutely ridiculous. 15 years ago, when people talked about international tax policy, and it's still true, but not nearly as much, not nearly as true as it had been, um, that uh, there were like two possible ways to think about what a good international tax policy was: capital import neutrality and capital export neutrality. Have you guys talked about that at all, Dr. Latif?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So this was not presented as just one possible way to think about what good tax policies were. It was presented as the only conceivable frame for understanding, and sort of every tax policy had to be either motivated by capital import neutrality or capital export neutrality, which is insane because no legislator ever has understood what either of those things mean, and they clearly were never motivating anything. But to live in a world where the global north is not talking about these things anymore. It's just talking about taking revenues. And the fact that they are now much more open about what they're doing, and again, that's why when the global minimum tax was first proposed, that there was no opportunity for the global south countries to create their top-up taxes, right? Money was just going to go into the coffers of the global north. And I loved still one of my favorite paper titles ever, by Afton Titus at Cape Town. She says, the global minimum tax, the death knell for African country taxation, because she showed how the first wave global minimum tax was just taking money from Rwanda and sending it up north to pave roads in the US and Europe. And the fact that they weren't able to present these policies as only about economic efficiency, that they were about taking money, made it possible for the global south countries to say, listen, if it's just about taking money, we get some of that too. Right? So what is happening is not nearly enough. I agree with you, Judy. It is terrible. It's really quite shocking. But what's great about it is it looks shocking. And I'm still surprised at how many of my colleagues here in the US look at guilty or global minimum taxes and are completely comfortable with the global north keeping everything. They see absolutely nothing wrong with that. They are untroubled by that. They don't see any duty owed to anybody outside of the United States. And it's a very, even for people who consider themselves progressive, there's a very America first mentality. But at least some people don't see it that way. So if they have to just present what they're doing as a revenue grab, there are people who are going to question if they just, again, blame Liberia. Or I loved when the EU rolled out its blacklist. It had Namibia on its blacklist. Like Namibian tax policies were really what were making Europe poor. Just such a surreal, right? I mean, God, if it weren't for Namibia, Europe would be rich, right? That's just such an insane thing. But they have to do that. Like when they do that, they look silly. Not to everybody, right? If you're in Brussels, imposing sanctions on Namibia for not having adopted the OECD's BEPS regime might seem reasonable. But if you're in Namibia or Kenya, you look at it and you say, that's insane. That is an insane thing that has happened. And the fact that they are reduced to doing these insane things is, over the long term, helpful. Not enough. But again, the distance traveled from 15, 20 years ago to today, you guys are young and that's wonderful, but you would not believe how impossible, how fantastical what's happening now would have seemed back then.
Thank you, Prof.
Thanks, Judy. Yes, thank you so much. Is there any other question from the rest of you colleagues? Isaac, would you want to? I'm sorry, I'm just like calling out your name, but is there something that you wanted to intervene, or even Afshin?
Thanks, Doc Leila. Just to say very massive congratulations to Professor Dean. It's all to listen to him and his presentations. Always very packed with insights that you won't get from anywhere else. So very good. And to the point about how an international tax system that has forever been skewed against global South countries, and then in turn, these global South countries, especially those in Africa and Bahamas, are blamed for the lack of revenue in the global North, to the point that, as you rightly mentioned, they now introduce the two-pillar solutions. And if you look at it, especially with Pillar 2, the whole idea is targeting global South countries who, for most of them, don't actually have, from years of underdevelopment and extraction, do not have the infrastructure and the other competitive factors to attract investment that create jobs and opportunities for their people. And so the only thing that they really have is, in some cases, their tax revenue that they exercise their sovereignty to decide to, not charge in order to attract investment and get jobs for their people and stuff. Now, Pillar 2 says you can't even do that. You have to, we, Global North, have better infrastructure. And so once they remove that tax incentive, as they are seeking to do under Pillar 2, the Global North have all the advantages. They have better infrastructure, they have better in terms of income levels and everything. And so there's very little incentive in businesses, setting shop in Global South, of course, unless it is for extractive resources and stuff like that, which are, location-based. So these conversations are always exciting. I have particularly been keen about the African agency that we are beginning to see at the UN. There are still concerns as to whether we can actually achieve in the short to medium term, the very realistic, objective of reforming global tax systems in a way that give African countries and the global South their fair share of taxes, in this residency source allocation paradox. But it's still an amazing step, and we are following it. And it's always a pleasure again to be part of these conversations. Thank you.
So glad you're able to be here, Isaac. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to see you.
Yeah.
I'll say that my mom met Isaac a few years ago, and will be so excited to hear that I've spoken to him today. She's a big fan. I will just say that what it's not. I see there's some hands, so I'll be short. What's so exciting is that, and I've told you the story about in that high school textbook that people really believed that after people were freed, blacks were freed in the U.S., they just lay down and died without a master to tell them what to do. These people don't believe that today, but I think that what was happening in the UN needs to demonstrate is not mastery, but what they're going to see is competence. They're going to see engagement. I think just the bar is so low for what I think has to be shown by the Global South in the UN process to really improve matters enormously. So I think a lot of people really still believe that the OECD should be in charge because they don't trust Global South countries to have this dialogue. And if Global South countries can show, because I think there are a lot of people who support OECD dominance in good faith, thinking that it really is best for everybody. I think some people are just greedy and horrible, but I think a lot of people who think that the OECD should be in charge because that's better for everybody, which is totally not true. But they have these very strange ideas about. So there was God, I said I'd be short, but I would. There's a tax anthropologist who interviewed people within the OECD about what was happening in the global minimum tax, and they asked somebody. I think it was somebody maybe from Switzerland. They didn't say who it was, but this woman said it was asked, why the global North? Why shouldn't the global North share revenues with the global South? And this woman said she knew she wasn't going to identify, but she knew her words would be, and she said, "No, these countries are incompetent. They need to get their affairs in order, and once they get their affairs in order, then we'll think about sharing revenues with them. But until they do that, we're not going to share revenues. And of course, that's backwards. If you don't give them any revenues, they can't develop. But that's the rationalization. But if these countries can really make clear that they are, ready to participate in this dialogue, which they clearly are, you guys are the perfect proof of that. That will really make a big impact. So I'm sorry I went on so long that somebody put their hand down, so I'll shut up.
No, that's amazing because we're learning so much. At least I am also expanding my knowledge library just listening to you and giving us all these facts. So we've got two more colleagues who have questions, and Lennox had his hand up first. So Lennox, the floor is yours, and then Afshin, you can ask your question, and then Professor, you can just wrap it up for us. So Lennox.
Thank you, Prof. I hope you're well. So sorry, once again, corporate caught up with me today, but quite an interesting and insightful discussion. Totally loved it, especially from a point of a Pan-Africanism point of view. I am personally a staunch Pan-Africanist. I am hoping that advancing this charter, for example, would be a worthwhile approach, so to say. And my question really is there hope then at the end of this tunnel when you look at it, Steve? And is there really a way? Because we have efforts as Africa, we are rising. And when you look at the recent proposal by Nigeria and them actually proposing retention of a digital services tax, significant economic presence, point of view, and, the querying OECD Pillar 1, so to say, and how that was heavily, put to question. And when you look at the exercise of veto, I know recently there was the proposed tax model that the US just vetoed out, and that was it. So really looking at such dominance in the international tax space, do we really have a light at the end of the tunnel, or is it going to take another Holocaust, so to say, to ensure that there is fairness, at least in the international tax dispensation? From your point of view.
It's a great question, Lennox. Thank you for asking. And again, just so delighted to meet all of you. It's really exciting. I would just say that for the first, I don't know, decade or decade and a half that I was in economics, you would have supposedly global tax conversations that would feature Europe and North America, and maybe if you're crazy, Australia. As though entire continents didn't exist, and it's just so wonderful to have conversations that show how wrong that perspective is. So thank you for being here. I guess what I would say is that is there light at the tunnel? I draw some optimism from, and again, I teach at Boston University, but my secret is actually live in New York City. We have a new mayor. I don't know if you know, have you heard of our new mayor, Zoran Mamdani, who actually spent his childhood in Africa. He is part of a very progressive group of politicians that are gaining in the U.S. They're proposing taxing the rich, and I think they face a lot of opposition even with the U.S. But new legislation has been passed in a variety of states. It's now pending in California. One of the founders of Google, Sergey Brin, is fighting it very hard because he's got a lot of billions he wants to keep. But there is, I think, a real appetite for tax measures that do threaten oligarchs. And I think if you are willing to do that, I think there is some real hope that these progressives in the United States will realize that there are billions of potential allies around the world that are excited to team up with them to tax these oligarchs. And I think there's a mistake that people make thinking that teaming up with folks in Africa who want to tax these oligarchs, that it's a zero-sum game for those who are on the outside. But I think there's a lot of power in that unity. So if we can get collaborations built between the tax of the rich progressive in the United States and folks in other countries that are interested in taxing global capital, we could really get something done. So I think there are opportunities for real powerful alliances across borders, and that's exciting.
Asante sana.
Perfect. And I think
yeah, go on, Lennox. This is the opportunity to ask as many questions as you can.
Yes.
Sorry.
I think this is the part I draw spanner in the works and query the international system. And just going back to John Austin's theory, the Austinian theory on international law as a toothless dog, so to say, and it just being merely guidance at most, such that some of the countries that are superpowers in the literal sense of the word don't have to heed to our call. And when you look at the alliances created, let's take BRICS, for example. Really, we can't compare the power that BRICS hold when compared to the NATO allies. And even US in their own literal sense, and the consent measure that guides the entire international law dispensation, that makes it quite difficult to advance some notions, especially where, taking the example of the United Nations Security Council, a country can veto a decision, and that decision stalls the entire progress of the international community. So I don't know what your thoughts would be on that, Dean.
No, I get that. So the UN is not perfect. If I were, my own preference would be maybe put ATAF in charge for 60 years. I think that would come close to making up for the OECD having been in charge for 60 years. And of course, give them all the revenues, all the resources that the OECD had for all that time. I think we might end up in a pretty good place if that were true. But I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that should happen. So one more story I'll tell from the book that I think is really encouraging. So the reason that OECD countries did not impose sanctions on Liberia in 2000 and 2001 was because a group of Black legislators in the United States stopped it from happening. So this is a group called the Congressional Black Caucus. They saw this list that the OECD had drawn up that didn't include Switzerland, but included Liberia. And they said, that's insane. And they wrote a letter to George W. Bush's Treasury Secretary. And soon after they did that, this Republican president withdrew support from the OECD. And they did it partly because they weren't a big fans of tax generally, but they also did it because they were getting pressure from, from far left folks. So I think it is possible for people in the global north, again, when presented with the kind of cruelty and absurdity that we're seeing, to say, that's crazy. We're not going to punish Namibia for not following the OECD's rules. We're not going to prevent Kenya from taxing global digital giants just because they're American. That's not, we don't believe in that. And I think there are people who are, when they see what's happening, and this is forced out in the open, right? This isn't happening behind closed doors of the OECD. When that's happening, nobody can object to it because nobody understands it. But when I tell people that my book is about a racist global tax system, many of them are, so depending on who you ask, some are confused about the racist part, and some say global tax system. What are you talking about? There's no such thing. I'm like, sadly, there is, right? So if you can tell people who would understand the first part that there is a second part, you can make real progress.
For sure. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dean.
Asante sana. Afshin?
Thanks, Dr. Leila, and good evening, everybody. Thank you also, Professor Dean. I really enjoyed your lecture. It was a really good lecture. I enjoyed how you delivered it. When Dr. Leila mentioned we'd have a lecture on race and tax, I've actually been really excited for it for the past week because I couldn't see how you would connect it. But I wish I could say I was, yes, I'm mind blown, but also infuriated by the sheer facts that you presented to us today. And looking at the way you framed tax, it really makes it feel like the international tax system is just maybe just cogs in a machine. When you look at the debt architecture, when we look at the tax architecture, the trade architecture, they're just cogs in a machine to make us as financially dependent on the West as possible. And racism itself is so subtle. Even when it happens in real life, you question whether you imagined it. Like even the coincidence that you mentioned on the 1960, the OECD Charter, and then the colonialism, many African countries gaining independence, and also the OECD Charter coming into force the same year. Like you also framed it as, could this be a coincidence? Probably not. So I think what makes it so hard to fight is how subtle it is. It works through language that sounds neutral, through institutions that are looking legitimate, and through frameworks that we have internalized so deeply that we even end up reproducing them ourselves. For example, through all of the tax treaties that we have. And even, for example, when I look at the debt parallel, the IMF and the World Bank, through the structural adjustment programs that they imposed on us, which they were not applying domestically, the Virginia parallel I thought was important here, because the conditionality is always assumed that it's always the African states' behavior which is the problem, and not the terms of the global economy that we have been inserted into. So given that this problem is so deeply embedded, how do we even get out of it? Because we rely on funding from the global north. They disregard international law and get away with it. The West pushes back whenever we try to fight them. For example, even the OECD pushing back for in the financing for development process, in the tax negotiations process. So what can we do in our position as, as students, as civil society, as states, given that to some extent we are also depending on these same institutions? Where do we even begin?
Well, so, again, I think what's so exciting about the conversation we're having today is that we're having it, right? Again, 20 years ago, this would have not happened. 10 years ago, we didn't know all that we know now. So just to acknowledge the distance that's been traveled for us to be able to have this conversation is really extraordinary. It's absolutely true. So again, I would say that one thing that I take some, hope from is that what's happening in the United States is so much better than it had been 80 years ago. So, so I'll give you an example. So there's another book by a history professor out on the West Coast, and she writes about, so the myth in the United States is that the reason that Blacks were not educated in the early 20th century was because whites were not generous enough to fund their schools, right? And that's bad, right? You should be that generous. It's good for everybody to have educated citizens. That's definitely true. But what was actually happening was that blacks were paying taxes and those revenues were funding white schools. Right? So it wasn't, the problem wasn't that whites weren't paying for black schools. The problem was that blacks were paying for white schools, right? And you know that went on, and people challenged that in court, and they won. But then the structures in place were so powerful that they just ignored the court victories. But over time, that changed, and now the schools are segregated still, and they're not perfect. But there was a time when black schools would be funded for a few months, when white schools would be funded for the entire year. And we've moved beyond that. So part of, I think once you see what is happening, it is possible to change it. And I think that, I can't emphasize enough how incredible it is that you guys are in this course. I mean, that is the key, to have so many smart people who are so knowledgeable about these issues. When people say things, you're going to question them, and you don't have to understand all the intricacies of race, international tax. But when when global North country says, "Yeah, you guys can't have a substantial economic presence tax just because," and you say, "Well, why not?" And they're like, "Well, you can't do it." You're not going to accept that, and you know that there's no reason for that. You understand that if it's a risk, right? So two risks. One, the incidence of that tax may fall on people in Kenya, but I don't think that's a problem. I think that's fine. I think you guys are trying to collect the revenues. You're not really fooling yourself into thinking that Google is really going to dip into its own pockets to pay the tax. You just want the revenues to be able to fund government. And two, if Google really objects to it, they can fight back. I mean, they don't need the OECD to protect them, right? Are we really so worried that Google is going to be taken down by Kenya and Namibia? that is not a reasonable fear. And again, when these fears have to be articulated, they are obviously ridiculous, right? And so smart people like you can ask those questions. When 20 years ago, there would have been nobody to ask those questions. So everybody taking this class that Dr. Latif is teaching is part of the solution.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor. I suppose I do not see any hands up, apart from Afshin giving the thumbs up. So I guess
I'll take a thumbs up. Yeah, listen, I feel terrible that I've taken up so much of your time. It's so generous of you to have me on your very last day. I really appreciate it.
No, we're very grateful, Professor. And I think I'm just going to end by saying thank you so much. And it's genuinely, thank you so much. You've come into our room and you have just not taught us tax law. You've actually taught us how to see it. And honestly, that is usually a harder and a rare thing to do. You have showed us that, just like Afshin said, that the law has a color and that the architecture has a history and that the history has names and dates and decisions behind it. And I think this is going to be really appreciative for us to think through the way in which we want to even reframe our understanding of international tax law. Like we have to go beyond looking at just the black letter of the law and the technicalities of it, but to understand the entire system and the process, and the substance that has pushed tax law to what it is today. So honestly, on my part, thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here and spending your time with us. And I hope you get to come to Nairobi soon so that we can have you in the classroom discussing this and engaging with us. Thank you so much, Professor.
I would love that very much. Everybody, good luck. Have a great day, and good luck for the rest of your semester.
Asante sana, Professor. We will release you now. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll pick up with an email. Asante sana. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'll sign off. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Hi, Isaac. Nice to see you. And then, great. So you guys, you decided never to show me your faces, but today Judy switches on her video and Lennox switches on his video. And I'm just like, oh, this is what my students look like. Great. Okay, so.
Dr. Leila, I've always had my video on.
Have you? Oh, I have not. Okay, so maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe I don't see properly on the internet. Okay, I see you now, but that's great. Thank you so much, my dear. Now, But so today is our last class, and initially I started talking about, a lot of things that were going through my mind, trying to package the entire discussions we've been having from day one to today. And before we close, I also want to leave you with something that should really make you smile, but also to get you to really think critically, okay? So you see, Professor spoke about John Maynard Keynes, right? Who I don't know when you were doing economics in school when you were told he was the most celebrated economist of the 20th century, a man whose ideas shaped the post-war international financial architecture. And this is the man we saw today on Professor's slide who described the League of Nations as the most monstrous monkey house ever assembled. I mean, I have no words for that. It's so disturbing because he was referring to the presence of non-European nations at the table. That was his language, right? That was his contempt. And yet the international tax framework we have been discussing all semester was built in the intellectual tradition that he helped establish by people who moved in the same cities, in the same circles, who shared the same assumptions and also looked at the world through the same eyes. So you see the racism here, right? And there's another book by this gentleman. It's excellent. This book is powerful. It's Alan Lumba, and it's called Monetary Authorities. He writes about the colonization of Philippines and then how the US, when they were trying to now liberate Philippines and getting rid of, colonialism and giving them independence, they made a statement to say that brown people should never be given access to white capital because brown people and by extension black people, they do not know how to handle money. Money is white, and therefore we need to create institutions that's going to safeguard our white money. So even money has color. I mean, it's sick. Anyway, now here is what I also want you to hold on to as we finish our class. The UN Tax Convention, which is the most significant reform of international tax governance, in this generation of us, and we're so lucky to be able to be part of these conversations about creating this new global tax treaty. It is the one that is going to reshape how the world thinks about taxing multinational corporations. And actually, it is being driven by Africa. This entire process is being led by Nigeria. Yeah. And it is being chaired by Ghana. And Isaac will tell you this, right? So you can imagine the importance of Ghana. Ghana is the co-lead in terms of getting the movement around Protocol 1 and also the UN Framework Convention, International Tax Corporation, the design of the template itself. So imagine this John Maynard Keynes, he should wake up from his grave, see all what is happening, cry, and then go back, right? Because this monkey house that he's talking about is actually running the entire zoo, and we're actually doing it pretty good. So now, I also want to talk about some important concepts. The concept of value creation. Okay, so many smileys about laughing. Okay, now, so value creation. Now, you see, under the traditional international tax framework, value was always understood in physical terms. You create value where your factories are, right? Where your employees sit and where your machinery operates. And also sometimes it's on the basis of where you go and sign your contracts. So that was how value was created, how value was generated. Now, tax, it follows that value. Simple enough, right? And for a world of manufacturing and physical trade, it's something that works because we get to see this factory and therefore we know we have to come and tax it. Now, think about streaming. When a student in Nairobi, here at the university, right, they open up Netflix and they watch a film. Now, Netflix has created value in Kenya. Now, that student's attention, right, their subscription fee, not that they pay it themselves, they take money from their parents to pay and watch rubbish on Netflix anyway. So that subscription fee, and then their data, and then their viewing habits, all of that is economically valuable. So Netflix has no office in Kenya. It doesn't have employees. It doesn't even have, servers, yeah, on our soil. So under the traditional permanent establishment rules, Kenya has no right to tax that transaction because the value is consumed here, but the tax goes somewhere else. And that is the problem of nexus insofar as international taxation is concerned within this digital economy that we are currently living under. And now also think about data. When you use a free platform, you are not the customer And you have heard this. There's a tagline that says, when you use free services, you are not the customer, you are the product, because your behavior, your preferences, your social connections, your location, all of it is harvested, it is then processed, and then it is sold to advertisers. Now, the value in that transaction, it is generated by you sitting in your office like Judy is, and the revenue it produces is then maybe booked in where, in Boston where Stephen is, or in Accra where Isaac is sitting, or even Singapore. Now, under the old rules, the jurisdiction where the user sits gets nothing because nothing was sold to them in a taxable sense. Yeah. So the value was extracted from them. There is a difference. And the problem is that the tax system as we have, the global tax rules that we have, does not yet know how to see this. And therefore, we have the opportunity to be able to make submissions to the UN when they're beginning to think through the design of Protocol 1. Because Protocol 1 is where we're going to be talking about the taxation of income from cross-border services in a digitized economy. So there's real need to be able to think through this concept and provide meaningful support to the UN so that when Protocol 1 is being developed, we are actually thinking through some of these really critical issues that are going to shape how we're going to be performing in this cross-border digital economy. So that was the first part. Yeah, on value. Then the second part I wanted to mention was a nexus, right? So nexus, if you remember the first class we did, when we talked about nexus, it is the connection, right, between a business and a jurisdiction, right? And it is nexus that gives the state, the jurisdiction, basically, the right to tax. So traditionally, nexus meant physical presence. Okay, so when you remember your TP class, we talked about permanent establishment. That's how nexus is identified, through the permanent establishment, the FOB rule, fixed place of business. Yeah. So you are here, therefore we can tax you. But in a digitized economy, in a hybrid economy, this concept of presence, it really becomes a fiction. Even in the metaverse economy, which is being tested right now in the US, and people are transacting in it, people are making money in it, the concept of presence is now reduced to an avatar. It's actually a fiction. So a company can now generate millions in revenue from a country where it has never incorporated, it has never hired, it has never rented an office. And under the traditional rules, then such a country can never have a tax claim. So to complicate this problem of nexus, think about high value, low frequency transactions. And then the problem in itself becomes really acute. So for example, think about I don't know, multinational corporation, right? That is selling one piece of software, or it's selling one algorithm, yeah? Or it is selling you one data license. And it is selling that to either another multinational corporation or a local company or even to the government. It's one transaction, but it has an enormous value, right? So I'm giving you this copyright license to use and I'm going to charge you $5 million. It's a high value transaction, low frequency because it's only happening annually. But there's no physical footprint for this. So which jurisdiction has the right to tax this? Where do we say the value was created? Where do we say it was delivered? Where do we say it was consumed? Where was the contract signed? And does that even matter anymore when contracts are executed even digitally across multiple jurisdictions, simultaneously? Then there's the argument, some clever people, high net worth individuals, they'll say, sometimes if you want a country to be able to say we can tax a portion of the profits that you've made on our jurisdiction, they'll simply say, hey, let's get onto our yachts, go to the high seas, because the high seas is no man's territory, right? So we can go and have a cup of tea on the high seas and sign our contract there. Now, when things like that happen, international tax law is not extended towards the high seas because there's no jurisdiction there. So you may think I'm just giving you hypothetical scenarios, but these things are happening. So then where do we get the tax system? How do we construe the tax system if you want to advise a government who comes and tells you all our high net worth individuals, the 4,000s of them, every 2 months they're going to have tea on the high seas and they're signing documents, they're signing high valued transactions which are low frequency. What do we do about that? So these are real questions, and we will have to grapple with them as we go forward. And then I think finally, it's also the point I wanted to make about corporate structures. And corporate structures is basically, when you want to play games within tax, you do that through corporate structuring. Yeah. Because I think when we talk about corporate structuring, this is company law, corporate law, how do you create this legal vehicle, special purpose vehicles, nominee companies, indirect agency rules that you come up with, for example. It is basically where the creativity of the tax planning industry actually sits. And it's so exciting because it's admirable. How do you design a company in such a way that you minimize or even completely offset global tax rules from applying? Yeah. So think about, again, a multinational technology company. Okay. So I don't want to give any names, but just think about one, whichever multinational technology company that you know, right? Say it establishes its intellectual property, it comes up with its patents, it has its own log of all the algorithms it has designed, it also has its brand value, but all of that is parked in a low tax jurisdiction. And usually low tax jurisdictions is usually Ireland, okay? So every subsidiary of that company that is operating in every country where it actually does business. It pays a royalty to the Irish holding company for the right to use that IP. So those royalty payments, right, as we know, are going to be deductible expenses in the countries where the subsidiaries operate. So the taxable profit in Kenya or in Ghana or in the US is reduced because the subsidiary has already paid most of its earnings to Ireland in the form of a royalty. And Ireland taxes the royalty income at a very low rate, or sometimes even through arrangements that effectively end up reducing the royalty rate even further. But the important thing is that that value was created in Africa, but the profit, it landed in Dublin. So you see, tax always follows the profit, not the value. And it's time to now change that conversation, especially since seeing the way in which digital business models are creating new forms of doing business. We cannot just simply rely on tax following profit, but tax has to follow value going forward if we're supposed to have any semblance of taxing rights left for our continent. Now, this is a legal issue. But it is also how we need to start understanding how companies are practicing this in real life, right? And I think this is what we really need to think about. And if you try and read Stephen's book on global Jim Crow, the racial capitalism and international tax governance, you're going to see some of these things play out. So now finally, I had a bit of time before our lecture today, and I was watching the Hunger Games. I mean, I don't know why I wasted my time on that, but I basically was just trying to understand the structure. And I could see when I was watching the Hunger Games, you have this wealthy, powerful. Afshin, you're laughing. You're the one who watches funny movies, and then you send me to watch them as well. So stop laughing. Anyway, you've got this wealthy, powerful capital, which is extracting resources from very poor districts, right? And it is forcing those districts to start competing with each other for survival. And it calls this a system. Now, the districts, they do not get to write the rules. They do not get to even question that structure. They're simply told, play and be grateful for the opportunity. And I was trying to see this and I was like, you know what? This Hunger Games is just like international tax law. International tax is also a game, right? The international tax system itself is the Hunger Game. You've got countries, especially our countries, developing countries. We are placed in competition with each other to offer the lowest taxes, the most generous incentives, the most flexible regulatory environments, all to attract capital that is then going to be controlled by a small number of corporations that are headquartered in either tax havens like Bermuda or Bahamas, where Stephen comes from. Yeah, or even like the Commonwealth dependencies like the British Virgin Islands. So the capital of the Hunger Games, yeah, it's what we get to see today in the form of the OECD. It is the one that is setting the rules. And the districts, which is basically us, we're competing for whatever investment that capital decides to deploy. So when the districts start to organize, like we're seeing through Ghana, through Nigeria, through Kenya, right? When they go to the United Nations and they demand for a fairer framework, they are told, you're being unrealistic, you're being ideological, you are anti-investment, you're not seeing the problem of multinational corporations. They will not want to come and do business in your country because you're making tax very difficult. Those are the arguments that we get. And I think if you go back on the UN, there's the UN TV, the web TV that also records some of the sessions that have already passed. And you get to hear some of the arguments that, UK is making, Germany is making, Luxembourg is fronting. And you'll be like, are these people serious? But that's the reality. That's the contempt, that John Maynard contempt that you actually get to see when they speak. So that is where international tax right now is at. And that is why the work of scholars like Professor Dean, and I'm hoping yourselves as you graduate from your master's class and you probably do your PhDs and you become serious scholars, you're going to have that political courage of pushing for an African-led process, not only at the United Nations, but also domestically. So when we get our finance bill and we start reading some of this significant economic presence and the way in which it is crafted, we should be able to counter back and say, we don't want to follow a particular model. We want to come and design that model for ourselves. Because just like the Hunger Games, the districts have to start looking up. And if we don't do that, we're going to be left behind. Yeah. So I think that is it in terms of what I wanted to say as my final parting shot to yourselves on international tax law. And now it is just for you to go back to revise. Your exams are coming up very soon. And I just want you to remember that tax is not only about money, it is also about power going forward. Okay. So, to take your time, review the slides that we have been going through. The exam that you're going to be dealing with doesn't really have like an essay type question. You're normally, most of the things that you're going to be asked are to advise the government or to advise a civil society on a hypothetical scenario. So you could get a scenario like, a company is digital, it's extracting so much of revenue from a particular country, it's not paying any tax in that country. Why? What can we do to ensure that we attract revenue from that country, from that particular company? So the most important thing is for you to start by explaining what the current law is like. Yeah, that the current law does not really change the understanding of permanent establishment, but there's already conversation happening at the global level and also at the national level through the significant economic present tax, for example, right? So use your knowledge, use your understanding of tax law to be able to provide advice because it's law. Right? In as much as we're doing tax, it's all about the law. So you'll be called upon as lawyers, for example, to now provide advice to a particular government or to a civil society and to generally just write maybe to the cabinet secretary proposing certain reform measures. So your question number one, I think, no. Because your CAT was out of 40 total, you have to answer 3 questions. So each question is 20 marks. I don't think there's a compulsory question. You can answer any. You'll have 5 questions. You just have to answer any 3 questions. And I think the exam is going to be on the Mtihani platform. So it's going to open up on the day of the exam and it's going to remain open for 4 hours. And you have to finish your exam within 3 hours. The additional hour that is given is for you to make sure that you upload your document in good time. If you delay, like some of you have delayed in sending the assignment, well, the loss is on your end, not mine. Okay, so that is it in terms of what I wanted to say. I see, Wendy, you have your hand up, my dear.
Yes, allow me to switch on my video.
Yay.
Sorry, I'm not necessarily a part of this particular cohort, the master's cohort, but I'm in your securities class.
Oh, wonderful.
I think we interacted today, and I am really happy that I was able to join this particular discussion. The discussions with Budget Ndio Story on the finance bill have really been magnified in this particular discussion. And there was something that I would love to ask, if you would permit me. there was last year some global companies such as Amazon, part of PayPal, suspended their services towards Kenyans. Or for example, Twitch was a streaming company, and since I was avidly looking into esports, Twitch streamers suspended their monetization to Kenyan players or Kenyan streamers simply for the fact that there was tax levied on their significant presence within the country, as well as the VAT on digital services. And so my question with that regard is that is this particular form of taxation, or what are your comments on this particular tax? Because there's some companies like Google and Microsoft that have complied with the taxation laws, but Amazon, with regard to streaming, declined and pulled out monetization for Kenyan digital streamers. So what might your comments be on that?
Thank you, Wendy. I'm going to reflect on that as I listen to Ruth. She also has her hand, and then I'm going to respond totally. So, Ruth, please go ahead.
Dr. How are you?
I'm okay. Thank you.
Perfect. My question is regarding the examinations. Thank you for highlighting that it will not be like the normal essay formats that you are used to in our assessments. My question is, if we are to issue like advisories and expert opinions, something like what you gave us in the last assessment, what is your expectation? Do you expect the styling and the formatting to be like, an opinion style? Literally.
I'm actually pulling up the exam as you speak. Hold on, I will just look at it. Great. Okay, so that's your question, my dear?
That's my question. I just need to know the formatting so that, rather than just get the exam and start hitting at the issues, what's your expectation? Do you want like a formal, how an expert opinion would look like? Would you like that format also, or an advisory or whatever, or we just answer the questions, the bottom line, using whatever method we'll use, yeah.
Yeah, you can't use whatever method, but I will respond to you shortly. Thank you for that question. So Wendy, thank you so much for joining the International Tax Law class. Wendy is my student at Securities Regulation, which is the undergraduate class. And today we invited guys from the National Treasury. They have a wing set up called Budget. No, it's called Budget Dear Story. And they had like a fascinating discussion on what public finance actually means and how it is tied to the role of the youth in the future. So I'm very happy that you asked this question, my dear. Look, when it comes to international taxation, it's all about political negotiation. That's how I see it. Sometimes it's not about the rules. And basically, every multinational corporation wants to maximize its profit going forward because we are in a privatized setting. We are a capitalistic society, and it is all about extract as much as you can, right? That is the Adam Smithian context of taxation, which Karl Marx has said it's actually violence, because he says the way in which capitalism is showing its face is creating a lot of violence at the society level. And this violence is not in the form of you and I picking up, equipment to hit each other. It's violence in the sense that we do not get to see services provided to us, which are our basic human rights. We do not get a fair minimum wage, which is competitive with certain developed OECD countries. That's the violence that is emitted on the person. So when you have a country that comes up with a law and says, look, you are extracting value from our country in a way that's very different from our understanding of income characterization, because Kenyan law says any income that is derived from, derived within, sourced from, sourced within Kenya, it must be taxed. And we've always linked income to value, and we've linked value to nexus, and we've linked nexus to a physical location. So if you have a company, if you can walk down to Safaricom and you see it has employees and you can see its balance sheets, you tax Safaricom. But now you have a company like Alibaba, like Temu, Shine, and Amazon, and all the ones that you know of. They don't have to have an office in our country. They don't need to have a single employee in our country, yet they're making profits out of Kenyans who are engaging on their platform through this process called user participation. Now, user participation is something that has brought about a different understanding of how we conceptualize value and nexus. So we have seen that, data today is valued at $1 trillion US. Amazon's profits have been at about 34 billion US dollars. OpenAI, the ChatGPT's father, it has generated profits in the semblance of 100 million US dollars. None of this is being taxed. Yet you will see statistics like 40% of Kenyan users are on ChatGPT. You're prompting ChatGPT, you're adding value to ChatGPT. That user participation is helping OpenAI generate that 100 million. But our Kenyan government doesn't get to tax it. And that's problem number one. So to counter that problem, the digital service tax was brought about as a way in which we can try and say, if you're a multinational corporation and you have the IP address that is being accessed by Kenyans, we should be able to tax you, and we're going to place that DST as part of, on the gross of your profits, and we're also going to add VAT on the same. So now, because the US has spoiled multinational corporations so much by simply saying we will not tax you because you fit within our research and development regime of incentives. So people like Amazon, companies like Amazon and Apple, they were already used to this incentives regime, that we are being protected by our master company, our president, our state, and therefore we can go into any other country, provide services, and we're not going to be subject to taxation because the tax laws that we are bound by are the American laws. What Dean was speaking about, GILTI, for example, right? The equivalent of GLOBE rules that we have at the OECD level. So now, when you had Kenya introduce DST, the knee-jerk reaction was, why are you taxing us? Because our own country is not taxing us. Who are you to tax us? And therefore, what companies do, especially when they are a monolith, right? They are this leviathan. They're so big that they are states themselves because they earn so much revenue, and some of their revenue is more than the GDP of low-income countries like Djibouti and Eswatini. So now they fight back and say, because you want to tax us, we're not going to provide you with services. Your citizens will not be able to engage on our platform. So that's the argument that they make, and then they suspend services. But there's this thing, the VPN. Even if Amazon has suspended services for a Kenyan and a Kenyan logs onto a VPN, they can still access the Amazon services going forward. So just like you said, Wendy, when Amazon and PayPal and others, they suspended services to Kenyan users because Kenya had the audacity to say, you are making money here. You are going to contribute here. That was not a business decision for them. And that was a political choice that Kenya made. It was a demonstration of power. It was the capital of Hunger Games, right? Reminding the district, Amazon, who holds the cards. And the argument that always follows is that FDI argument that if you tax us, we're going to take our business elsewhere. We're not going to bring in our investment. We're not going to bring in our capital into your country. So if you tax us, we will leave. That is the oldest threat in the book. It is the same logic that has kept the colonial tax system extractive for decades, right? So do not ask too much, or the investment is going to go elsewhere. Do not regulate too firmly, or jobs are going to disappear. It is a threat that only works if you believe you have no alternatives. And it is a threat that conveniently ignores the fact that Kenya itself is a market, and we are a powerful market in East and Central Africa. So you could see, in as much as DST brought about problems, DST had its limitations. We could not always, capture all of the multinational corporations because of the different thresholds that DST brought about. But then we eliminated DST, Wendy, and we came up with the significant economic presence tax, which now doesn't apply the OECD threshold of 750 million, or is it 20 billion, but it just basically says as long as you're earning revenue from this country, we're going to deem that you're making a certain amount of profit, and we're going to tax that at 3% going forward, right? So Wendy, that has been the politics, the nuances behind the question that you have asked me, and I hope the answer sits well with you, and that you're going to, after your exams, enroll for your master's so that you can come to this class and we can have more discussions going forward. Now, to Ruth, let me see what I have actually asked. Yeah, so your exam is open book. You answer any 3 questions, and then you're supposed to, yeah, so there's one part that says you are supposed to critically analyze. So what does it mean to critically analyze? It means that you're supposed to present both sides of the arguments. And that is where you don't necessarily have to have a format or a template, like, you're writing a legal opinion. That's not what you do. Here, you're supposed to identify and critically analyze certain issues that you've been asked for. So you identify the issues first, that these are the 6 issues or 5 issues or 1 issue that is, key from the problem facts that this particular question has presented for us. Once you've identified that, and please do not write in bullet points for me. Bullet points just means you get a 0 immediately. LLM exams are about prose, academic style writing, not bullet points, okay? So you identify that. We have identified 6 points. Point number 1 is XYZ. It is an issue because blah, blah, blah. And then you go on to critically analyze. If it is an issue, yeah, so say, for example, there is no law that taxes the digital economy. That's an issue. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? That is critical analysis, right? It's a good thing because it's good for the companies. It's a bad thing because the government is not collecting revenue. So once you've done the pros and cons, the critical analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of this issue, you make your final conclusion. You say, in my opinion, I would advise. So that way I get to see that you've not only analyzed the law, but you've also provided your expert insight into answering this question. And then you will be told, for example, advise the Kenya Revenue Authority on XYZ. So when you're advising, you don't have to, for this particular question, you don't have to write a legal advisory note. You don't have to have that sort of format because the question is only 8 marks. If it's a 20-mark question, then you can, think about the format and all. But 8 marks, you're told advice. So you simply say, in my advice to KRA, I would suggest da 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 da. So at least from the start, you've already told your examiner that you're writing in the form of providing an advisory opinion to KRA going forward. So that is how you would answer one of these questions. Oh, and then of course, sorry, there is an essay question. Oh yeah, because I think Professor Odote said that there must be one. So now you have an essay. Now, how do you write essays? An essay has to be well structured, okay? So you have to have the introduction. And in the introduction, you have to set out very clearly how you're going to approach the answer to the question that you've been asked. And then you provide the structure. You say, therefore, this essay is divided into 3 sections. Section 1 is the introduction. Section 2 will address limitation of benefits. Section 3 will address, I don't know, Jim Crow, okay? So you're already giving us the structure. And then you start section 2, you underline it, you put the heading, and then you start making your arguments. So for an essay, you have to have the structure because there's specific marks for structuring the work in a logical, orderly manner. So that is what I would tell you. And then, then you'll be told draft a structured legal memorandum in response to certain instructions. So you'll be told here very clearly, draft the structured legal memorandum. So how do you draft a memo? Yeah. Now, each one of you can think about drafting a memo from a different perspective, but generally a legal memorandum is something similar to a legal opinion, the way it is structured, right? So what are the facts? What are the issues? Just the IREC method that you're trying to convert into some sort of a submission. That's how you will structure it going forward. And then, you've got a very easy question. There's a question that simply asks you to say true or false. So you have like a statement and then you say true or you say false. It's very simple. And then finally, Yeah, so it's just about analysis, and the only drafting that you might have to do in terms of providing legal advice is on that legal memorandum, and you'll be told very clearly draft. So Ruth and the rest of you, I hope that is clear.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you.
The exam is so simple. I'm just wondering, maybe I should just make it difficult because you already are tax thinkers and it's going to be quite interesting. So there's nothing that is coming beyond what we have been discussing in class. So just focus on some of the key discussions we've been having. Yeah, if I keep talking, I'll just basically leak the exam for you. So let me just keep quiet. Great. So Judy, you have like X sign. Why?
Yes, I wanted to tell you not to make it more difficult.
Oh, okay, I will not make it very difficult. Fantastic. So I see Riva Jolipa from Amnesty International has joined us. Unfortunately, Riva, you've come in late because Stephen Dean finalized his lecture, and then we had some discussions around different aspects of international taxation. I'm so sorry you missed out on that. But now that you're here, hopefully the next time we have an international tax law class, you'll be one of our guest speakers. So stand, you have been notified.
Oh. Yes, please. I saw it late on LinkedIn and I joined immediately. I saw it. So
Oh no, next time I'm going to make sure we.
me.
No, shame on Afshin, she didn't study to you directly. She
Noticed.
and their friends. What kind of
Yes.
friendship is this? Kidding. Great. So
Imagine. So thank you for having me.
most obliged, my dear. So are there any questions? Or are we good? And yeah, nothing else from my end. But I hope you learned a lot from this class. I do hope. I mean, it would have been better to be in person, talking to each other in a classroom, but we only had this medium where you never switch on your videos, only you did it for Stephen Dean. And because of that, I'm going to deduct 2 marks from all of you. I won't do that. Don't complain. I'm just kidding. So great. So guys, it's almost 8 o'clock. Today was the last class. I wish you all the best in your exam. If you have any queries related to the substance of the discussions we've been having, please just email me and we'll be able to have a discussion going forward. I want to thank you very much for your contributions to this class. And I don't know what more to say except that I hope our paths cross and that we get to be formidable players in the international tax law field. So thank you, Judy, for clapping. The rest probably don't care. Riva has a heart. That's very nice. And now I see others clapping as well. Asante sana. Take good care of yourselves and until we meet somehow. Have a lovely evening and all the best. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you so
Bye.
much. See you.
Asante ni sana. Good night, guys. Bye-bye.